everybody. It's nice to see you all. I'm going to press a button so that I don't see you during the talk, so I can see my full screen. I'm actually with the Fairfax County Master Gardeners, which is a different organization, although the Northern Virginia is kind of an umbrella. And I'm happy to talk to you today here about orchid basics. If I were there in person, I would want to get some idea from you about how familiar you are with growing orchids, but we'll just go right to the presentation. And if you have questions, I don't know if you're comfortable typing them into the chat feature. If you're not, or even if you do, I will pause a couple of times during the presentation to take your questions. And I'm ready to go. So this is an overview. This talk, it doesn't get into huge depth on particular varieties, but after this, you should have a pretty good sense of what you need to do to successfully grow an orchid. And I do have some sources for additional information in the program. So I just wanted to, this is from the Philadelphia Flower Show in 2019, and they had an incredible orchid display, and it just gives you an idea of what you could do if you had unlimited orchids and an unlimited budget, neither of which I have. So the orchid family is the largest plant family with 35,000 species, and every country and every state has orchids. The orchids grow in different places. Most of us are familiar with the epiphytes, which grow on trees, but they also grow on rock surfaces, in vegetation on the forest floor, and in soil or sand. We have a couple native orchids here in Virginia, and I follow a couple of Facebook groups that the Virginia Native Plants Facebook group, and I've seen recent pictures of a couple of orchids that are throwing out leaves right now, interestingly, in the forest floor. They're tiny, so you really have to know what you're looking for, but if you're interested, you can even find orchids here in Virginia. Orchids have two main growth habits. The monopodial, which is one main stem, and this picture is a monopodial orchid. It means one-footed. The phalaenopsis orchids that we are so familiar with and we see everywhere are monopodial. They have aerial roots. And this is a picture of a Vanda orchid with the spotted flowers. They're very beautiful also. Then down here, the sympodial have multiple growth points, and the cattleyas and the oncidium orchids grow like this. I'm going to spend some time talking to you about roots, because orchid roots are really the key to growing a successful orchid. Orchid roots are covered with a substance called velamin, which prevents water loss. It takes up the fertilizer and the water, and it helps them attach to whatever they're growing on. to grow orchids in the home, these are the factors that you have to consider. And we'll talk about all of them. The water, how you water with, your light exposure, your temperature, humidity, air movement, and what you pot your orchids in. And orchids care a lot about all of these things. So you have to, it's not one size fits all. So you have to understand what you're working with, and that will help you when you grow your orchids. So I'm guilty of this. I don't know how many of you are too, but I'm guilty of, it used to be that it was not easy to find orchids. Orchids were really expensive, and you would find them in nurseries, and you know, they were grown by growers, and you know, they were an unusual plant. Nowadays, because of the proliferation of sort of mass orchid propagation, we see orchids in a lot of places, including supermarkets. So my guilty pleasure is to grab orchids from Trader Joe's. They have they have small and medium and large orchids, and they're beautiful. I believe that buying these inexpensive orchids, that they become harder to grow down the road. And a lot of times people buy orchids nowadays the way they would buy a flower arrangement. They just buy the orchid and, you know, have it sit on the table. And a lot of times they'll bloom for weeks, if not longer. And then when they're done blooming, they throw them away. I always try to keep them and take care of them and rebloom them. And that's what we're going to be talking about here today, is how to do that. So when you buy an orchid, from wherever you buy an orchid, be it Merrifield, which has really good plants, Costco or Trader Joe's, try to examine it carefully the way you would any house plant. Orchids are prone to pests and diseases, which we will also discuss later. The orchid should be firmly contained in the pot. You want to look at the roots. It should have new growth in the leaves, and it should have fresh root growth too. That would be the sign of the healthiest orchid that you could get. Some more details about when you select an orchid. We've really covered these top 5. So if you buy an orchid that has bloom stalks on it, you want to see a strong bloom stalk. You want to see that all of its buds are not open yet. They can open very gradually over a long period of time. Sometimes you can get orchids with 2 bloom stalks, which is extra bonus. So those are the things you should look at. And sometimes they're all encased in plastic, and it's really hard to examine it as well as you would if you were looking at an orchid from a good nursery. But these are at least some of the things you should look out for. So let's spend a little time talking about orchid roots. Most cultivated orchids' roots are epiphytes, and so they hang in the air and are dependent on gas exchange. the way to kill an orchid, an epiphytic orchid, and it's fairly easy to do, unfortunately, is to water it too much, to not repot it when it needs to be repotted, and to, you know, plant it in the wrong medium. So these orchid roots need access to air, and if they don't get it, they're not going to survive. Let's see. So epiphytic orchid roots, as we mentioned before, like all orchid roots, are covered with this velamen. And the thicker the roots are, the more air they need. So if you have thick roots, this is for your Phalaenopsis, for example, you need to have a coarser medium that will dry out faster. So orchid bark, I have pictures of some other media that you can pot in. It's possible to buy a prepackaged orchid mix that has bark and charcoal and some big perlite in it. That's typically what I go for when I'm repotting my orchids, but it's by no means the only medium that you need to consider. Thinner rooted orchids like Oncidium or Dendrobium need a finer medium that will hold more water. It makes sense, right? They're less dependent on the air. And then terrestrial and semi-terrestrial orchids like Cymbidiums. My mother always just called them frags and paphs. So I'm going to abbreviate them this way. They need water, a lot more water. And they're the kind of lady slipper orchids that you've seen. Very different growth from the Phalaenopsis. And so they like more water, not less. For your pots, you're worried about drainage. You want holes, enough holes that the water can drain freely, quickly, and completely. So I'm sure you've seen different kinds of orchid pots. I often use a clear plastic orchid pot that has holes on the sides as well as the bottoms. If you want to grow an orchid that needs more water, or you want to water less often, plastic is good. If you want an orchid if you're growing an orchid where the roots need more air, you can use a clay pot. It's up to you. Just remember to match your watering needs to the kind of pot that you use. So these are some of the different potting mediums, media that you can use to plant orchids in. Bark, very common. Charcoal is nice. It helps keep the medium fresh a bit longer. Pebbles, cork, all of these things that are pictured here, as long as it drains well and allows air penetration. And the two that you're going to see most often in the orchids that you buy commercially are orchid bark and sphagnum moss. So the bark, the advantage of the bark is that it lasts a long time. It doesn't break down as fast. So it can last up to 2 years before you have to repot. The moss needs to be replaced much more frequently. And it can break down and turn sour much more quickly. And a lot of the orchids that you see at places like the supermarkets are in the sphagnum moss. So be prepared to understand that you're going to have to repot those more often. So the better orchids are in often in the bark, and one of the good things about bark is if you water too much, it drains so well and it absorbs less, and so it's more forgiving. It's harder to overwater with bark. And the moss, as I said, again, it does hold the water, the nutrients in the air, but it can be really easy to overwater it. Here are some other media that you can use to pot in. The bottom line is that orchids can adapt to a lot of growing media as long as your watering schedule complements it. Okay, the next part of this presentation is about repotting. It has a lot of photographs, so I thought I could stop here for questions, if any of you have questions.
There's two questions, Marlene.
Okay.
Elaine. The first one is, what about the ones, I think they're talking about Phalaenopsis, that say you put ice cubes on them?
I go into that a little later.
Okay, well,
so why don't we, I'll give you my bottom line. I think it's a gimmick. And we can talk about why that is when we get to it a little further in the presentation.
Okay, and the second question, Elaine, is how do you know when the orchid is ready to be repotted? And I think you may be coming up to that later in the presentation too.
Yes, I'm getting there very shortly.
Okay, very good. Those are the two that we have.
Okay, any more?
I have one more question. My orchids are sending huge roots out of the pot.
Mm-hmm.
And what do I do with them? I mean, they're way over the edge of the pot, like 5 or 6 inches.
Yeah. Well, you're gonna need to try to repot that orchid and get a lot of those roots into a medium, because you might not be able to get all of them, and it's not unusual to have orchids roots that grow over the pot. But in order for them to absorb water and nutrients, they need to be sort of in something that will hold them so that you can water them properly. Otherwise, they're just taking in air, which is, important. But, if you were in a forest and they were growing everywhere, they'd be getting rainwater, and they would have a lot more opportunity to absorb nutrients. But in your house, that's not going to happen. So
some are growing up and some are growing out, and some are...
Well, let's take a look at some of these pictures of repotting and see if that will help. As I said, having some of them, you don't want to cut them. You don't want to cut healthy roots if you can help it. So as long as you have enough roots, healthy roots in the medium, they don't all have to be in the medium. But if you have a situation where the roots that are in the pot are kind of old and starting to go, and all of your roots are good roots or growing up and out, then you're going to have to think about repotting. So let's talk about repotting. It's really not that hard to do. You just have to, get your materials together, and you don't want to do it when the orchid is blooming if you can help it, because you will probably lose the blooms. But we'll proceed right through here and cover some of these points. So your medium, if you're going to use bark, I don't know if you've noticed, you know how hard it can be to get fresh potting soil to absorb water, and a lot of times you have to soak it in a little water to get it to start absorbing, or it will sort of repel the water. Well, bark is like that, only more. And if you don't do something to help the bark absorb the water before you pot, then it may never do that, later on down the road. So this step is really important if you're going to be using orchid bark. You can either soak it for 24 hours, or you can pour boiling water over it and let it cool down. But it's really critical to do this if you want your bark to be able to absorb the water. So there you go. That's my first tip. So here's some orchids that are good candidates for repotting, and you can see the roots growing over the sides. And some of them are growing up and some of them are growing down. So when it gets to be looking like this, you should start thinking about repotting. Here's some actively growing roots. That's a good sign to look for when you repot. Here's some roots that are not growing as actively. You can see the difference. Color is different, and these are not growing as actively, but they're still good roots. I might be missing a slide here. Anyhow, all right. And then, sorry. Then, okay, so we've decided we're going to repot this orchid. You can see this one's been growing in some pebbly stuff. So I forget the name of that medium, but you can grow in little rocks. So we've dumped out this orchid, and you're going to pick it up and you're going to examine the roots. And you have to look for the dead roots. So you can see in this picture, the person is holding a dead root, and it's brown, and you can see that long thready like piece in the middle. Those are dead. Sometimes they're not completely dead, but they're well on the way, and you want to cut off those roots. When I was looking at this picture this morning, I was wondering why she's using what looks like rusty trimmers, but whenever you cut roots or are trimming plants or anything else, you really do want to use clean, sterile equipment so that you don't spread disease. So I'm not sure about this particular picture, but she is trimming the roots, and that's important. So now what we have is, I don't know why this is advancing by itself, forgive me, but okay, so now we have the orchid, and the dead roots are over, in the bottom of the picture, and the healthy roots are left. And that's when you want to start repotting. So if you have to remove leaves to get a lot of the roots into the medium, you do that very carefully. Better to remove a leaf than have it be below the surface of the medium, because as we'll discuss in a few minutes, if water collects in those leaf axils, orchids rot incredibly easily, and it's another way to kill a plant. So if you have a lot of roots that are growing above the leaves, then you should think about removing the leaves so that you can get the majority of the roots into the pot. Then you get a larger container that's hopefully gonna hold your orchid. You position the orchid in the pot. You're gonna, probably gonna have to hold it in place, steady it while you start putting the medium in. And then you start, gently putting your medium in and around your roots. And, you're gonna have to tap the pot to get it to settle. You may have to work it in some with your fingers, because you don't want to leave a lot a lot of holes. You want them to be in contact with the medium so that they'll absorb the water and the nutrients. And you keep going that way until you get to the crown. And there you go. There's what a nice, healthy orchid looks like when it's repotted. Then you water well, and you're finished. And I don't know why this is advancing by itself, but I don't know whether I have it on slideshow or something. But anyhow, forgive me if I'm toggling back and forth between these pictures. But anyhow, you water well when you're done, and that's how you repot an orchid in that particular kind of medium. Here's another example of repotting in bark. So this person has gotten some bark that they've been soaking, and they also have a separate bag of charcoal. So put some of the bark in the bottom. Again, you position the orchid in the pot, you fill it, you tap it, you get it nicely settled, and then you're done. So that's how you repot in bark. So if you, I can pause here if there's any questions about repotting. Did we cover your question about all those roots that are growing out of the pot?
I'll do my best.
Okay.
And the other question from Marlene was, how do you know when it's ready to be repotted?
Well, so first of all, if you're growing in moss, you should just assume that you're going to repot it every year. Spring is a good time to repot orchids. Doing it, as I said, when they're flowering, you'll probably lose your blossoms, so you don't want to do it then. you know, if the orchid is growing actively, you got new leaf growth, you got new root growth, you probably don't have to worry about repotting. But you should assume that you're going to repot your orchids, the ones that are growing in bark, every couple years, and the one or more, and the ones in moss annually. If the orchid is starting not to look so good, you know, you can see a lot of roots that don't look great, and it's not growing very vigorously, then you should definitely think about repotting. And again, if you have, you know, you have tons and tons of roots growing out of the pot, and you want to get more of that, you know, and you don't have a lot of root growth anchoring it in the bottom, that would be another time to repot. Shouldn't have to do it more than once a year. Okay, any more? All right, so let's talk about watering. Watering is, you know, watering, I think, is the biggest challenge for those of us who try to grow orchids, because it's especially if you're the kind of person who likes to water on a schedule, it can be really easy to overwater the orchids. So as we talked about earlier, you want good drainage. You want it to dry out between watering. And other than that, it gets to be pretty individual. So this slide says use rainwater if possible. I don't use rainwater, but I do use my filtered water. I have a little water filter for, you know, the tap water that I drink, and I use that for watering my orchids. You can also let your tap water sit for 24 hours. That will get rid of, you know, some of the things in it that you don't want to put into your plants. But watering with tap water straight out of the tap, it's not your best choice. Some people use distilled water. We'll talk about that a little bit more. So water in the morning, that's true for most plants, just because they're going to take up the most nutrients then, and you don't want to worry about having water on leaves at night, because it's, you know, you're more prone to diseases and things like that. As we talked about earlier, don't get water in the leaf axils, you know, where the leaf joins the stem, or you're very likely going to get rot. And once orchids start rotting, they're really hard to save. I have a couple of tips in a bit, but really be careful about not getting water on the leaves. And then the ice cubes. Okay, so what's the deal with the ice cubes? The only real benefit to using ice cubes is that it controls how much water you give them. It's sort of a built-in disciplinary measure. So if they say do 3 a week and that's all, that, you know, it works out to, you know, a quarter cup or something per plant. It drips in slowly, you know, as they melt. And so, you know, if you're prone to overwatering, or you don't want to, you know, think too much about watering, then you can use ice cubes. But that's really the only benefit there is, and there are things that are detrimental. Or remember that a lot of the orchids that we grow are tropical plants, and they've never seen an ice cube in their lives. They're much more used to tepid water. So ice can actually injure orchids. If that touches the leaves, it can injure the leaves. And, ice is not necessarily any purer than your tap water. So it can have some things in it that you might not want in your water. I have so if you go on the internet, about orchids and ice cubes, unfortunately, because of the algorithm, the first thing you're going to pull up is all of the sites for ice cube orchids, and they will just tell you that they're fine. But if you go to a link like this, the Oregon Orchid Society, you'll get a lot more information that's reliable. And the bottom line is that they don't recommend it. So if you have an orchid and you're using the ice cubes and it's working great for you, then I'm not saying you should stop. Whatever you're doing, is working. And so, if it isn't broke, you don't have to fix it. But as a matter of science and culture and orchid care, it really is kind of a gimmick.
Thank you for that. That was from Ginger. And I managed to kill an orchid every year, so that could have been a reason. Thank you.
Okay, let's see. Water thoroughly. You want the water running out of the pot. You really want to saturate the media when you water. During the winter, use tepid water to avoid cold damage. I always try to water with room temperature water. If I'm using water from my faucet, this isn't just for orchids, this is for my house plants generally. If I have time, I like to let it sit and let, the various unfriendly gases and things sort of evaporate. And I think it's better for your plants. I don't know how many of us have well water. But if you're using tap water, if you're using well water, I guess you can have minerals and things that you want to try to flush out. You can buy distilled water, mix it 50-50 with your water. As I said, if you have access to easy access to filtered water, or you let your water sit out, that's a good thing to do. So, does anybody have any questions about the watering? Okay, so orchids are classified as warm, intermediate, or cool temperature loving orchids based on preferred winter mediums. So the Phalaenopsis, for example, likes your nighttime temperature to be above 60, or your Cattleyas will be happy with 50 to 60 degrees at night, and your Cymbidiums like it cool. It can be 50. I mean, I have to confess, I have a Cymbidium that I inherited that I take outside every summer, and in the winter I keep it in my unheated garage, which I don't ever let get to freezing. but it often gets below 50 degrees. So they're one orchid that can take cooler temperatures pretty happily. Okay, humidity. Orchids tend to like humid air. We were talking right before this presentation about the havoc that the dry air in our homes plays with our sinuses and our skins, and you know, orchids don't like it either. They grow, you know, a lot of the ones we grow grow in the forest where it's very humid. So what you can do about that is you can, I often put pebbles, gravel in the saucers below my orchids so that the pot is sitting well above the water, but you can leave a little water in the saucer so that it can evaporate, and that can increase your humidity. You can also run, you know, if you have a room full of orchids, you can run a humidifier. You know, those plug-in humidifiers that are not expensive, and they can increase the humidity in your air too. They're good for you, good for your plants. So yes, here's some of the solutions: a humidifier, trays or dishes with gravel, and grouping plants can also help. You know, they'll help each other. The plants themselves can help increase the humidity if you have enough of them. So orchids also require different degrees of light. And some of them want a lot of light, medium light, or lower light. One tip to know is that for a lot of healthy orchids, the leaves are light to medium, green, yellow, not really dark leaves. That can be a sign that it's not getting enough light. So for those of us who are growing orchids in our windows, and that's me now, although I think I'm going to get some grow lights pretty soon. All of these exposures, east, south, west, and north, you can grow them in all of those exposures depending on the orchid and its needs. So you need to know whether it's you know, morning light is often really good. You've got to be careful with west or southwest exposure to make sure you're not going to get too much sun and burn the leaves. Grow lights or greenhouses are very nice. And then if you have some place to put them, and you can take your orchids outside in the summer and put them in partial shade, they really love that. I think I'll take a moment to talk about my mom for a minute. My mother was a champion orchid grower, blue ribbon orchid grower, and at one point she had a lot of grow lights. She had what she called light units, and she had I think 1,000 orchids in her house. Every summer she would haul them all outside and bring them all back, you know, in the fall. And they really did love it. It's one of the best things you can do for them. Now, she lived in Pittsburgh, and the light isn't as strong there as it is here. So you really have to be careful if you're going to take them outside to not put them in, you know, full sun. They like dappled shade, partial shade, or else the leaves will burn. Leaf color and shape can give you clues about whether they're getting enough light. Dark green leaves can be an indication of insufficient light. Leaves that turn reddish purple, too much light. Hard and thick leaves can show you that the orchid came from a semi-arid climate, so you know that those leaves don't need as much water. Leaves that are hard and upright or skinny can show that they need a high light. Leaves that are flat and wide indicate lower light environment. And lack of obvious pseudobulbs in Sympodia orchids indicate the plant likes moisture. So leaves can tell you some things about what your orchid wants in terms of how you take care of it. Going to move on to fertilizer unless people have questions. Okay, so fertilizing. This top bullet point is something that I do. My mother taught this to me. You know, instead of full strength fertilizer, she never did. You know, most of the time when you use full strength fertilizer, it sort of suggests fertilizing once a month. She always fertilized at lower strength more often. So weekly and weekly. The homonyms. Do it half strength, quarter strength in the winter, and do it fertilize every time you water. I mean, obviously, if you start to see fertilizer salts building up, you need to cut back and you need to flush those salts out. But orchids do like a continuous source of weak fertilizer. A good orchid fertilizer is balanced 20-20-20. So evenly distributed with the phosphorus and the nitrogen and the potash, and then with added micronutrients. I really, Peters or Jack's, I like their fertilizers if you're not going to use an organic fertilizer. And those are good. You can find that online or in, you know, at your local nurseries often have them.
What were the names again?
Peters, P-E-T-E-R-S, and they're also known as Jacks, like the name Jack. Used to always be Peters, but I've seen Jack, so I don't know if Jack bought Peters or what, but they're basically the same company. I mean, there's other fertilizers that you can get that. I know that there are, you know, it's good to get orchid specific fertilizers. And you can find those too, but the best ones are these balanced ones. I know they sell orchid fertilizers that try to, you know, advertise that they're bloom boosters, but you really want, you know, in order to get blooms, you need healthy leaves and you need healthy roots. And so a balanced fertilizer is a good way to go. Signs that your orchids may be deficient in some minerals. If your old leaves turn yellow, that can be a sign of a nitrogen deficiency. If your new growth turns black, a calcium deficiency. And if you have interveinal yellowing of old leaves, that can be a sign of a magnesium deficiency. So a good rule of thumb is that the longer the root tips, the faster the orchids are growing and the more fertilizer they can use. Better to under-fertilize than over-fertilize because the roots are susceptible to fertilizer burn. Moving on to air movement. Okay. Moving air is really helpful for orchids. Gentle air movement. My mom had fans in her in the rooms. She had humidifiers and fans to solve that issue. But she had a whole room devoted to orchids. So if you have a ceiling fan in a room where you're growing orchids, turning that on will be helpful. So if you obviously not in the middle, if you have a window, that can be helpful too. But of course, as with everything, you want some air movement, but not too much. So the bottom line is that you want adequate air movement, which will help ensure robust growth and help to ward off disease caused by stagnant conditions. So if you're getting a lot of root rot, you don't think that you're overwatering, one thing that you can try to do is increase your air movement. Just wanted to go over a couple of different types of the orchids that we grow that we're familiar with. Before I go there, does anybody have any questions? Okay. So the Phalaenopsis, that's the one we see everywhere. Beautiful orchids, they also call them moth orchids. You can see why. They're monopodial. They don't need high light. They like bark or moss, warm temperatures, and the flowers can last a really long time. My mom's orchid, some of her bloom stalks lasted for months. Cattleyas, those are the ones that they always used to use in the corsages, right? For proms and things like that. Cattleyas are sympodial. They like medium to high light, intermediate temperatures. They're stunning. The dendrobiums are, the ones with the sprays of flowers, like dendrobiums and oncidiums. They're sympodial, different light requirements, intermediate temperatures. Here's a Paphiopedilum. I think I'm saying that right. They also call them lady slipper orchids. You can see that. And those are the ones that really, they can take a lot more moisture. They're gorgeous. And the Cymbidiums. They like a lot of light, cooler temperatures, long grassy leaves. They come in all kinds of different colors. I'm sure you've seen them. They're beautiful. All right, so I was going to move on to the bane of our existence, problems with orchids. Does anybody have any questions?
Where do you recommend buying Cattleya orchids?
I would look at Merrifield or, Merrifield has a good orchid selection. You probably, can order in the summer. You could probably order them online from different orchid growers. I haven't done that, but there are reputable ones online. There used to be a place up in Kensington that sold a lot of orchids. This was a long time ago. But I would go online, and look for a place that specializes in orchids. And you can find a lot more variety. Shall I go on? Okay. So here's a recipe for a homemade bug spray. This, I can't vouch for this myself. I got this from the internet, but I have often used combination of alcohol and little dish soap, diluted. And those are, those are things we have around the house that can help deal with pests. I don't know if you all have issues with pests in your orchids. It's something that I fight, and particularly mealy bugs are a problem for me. But so scale, if you have scale on your orchids, that it looks like this. There's the young ones, the young scale insects that are either pale or light brown, and then the ones that are dark have the shell that has covered over them that make them much harder to kill. But the best thing to do is a Q-tip and rubbing alcohol and go after that scale. Or there are some very effective systemics if you are willing to use those with your plants. And insecticidal soap too, but the problem is that once that you get that brown shell, it's very, very hard for anything to penetrate. So you really need, to get in there and rub it off with the alcohol yourself to be effective. Then we have the mealybugs. Same recommendations in terms of getting rid of them, if you can ever get rid of them, which, they're really hard to get rid of. And unless you have an orchid that's a really prized orchid that you want to try to save, you're gonna, they hide in the leaf crevices, they hide in the roots, they're sucking insects, so they take away the vitality of the plant. But I have a really hard time. This is just me. I'm not recommending this as a general practice, but I have a hard time throwing away plants. So I will spend time trying to eradicate things like mealybugs and scale. Other people would tell you just throw the plant away before it spreads to your other plants. So the ruthless people are probably the better ones, but anyhow, if you're not ruthless and you want to try to save them, here's some methods for dealing with them. Those are the two worst as far as insects are concerned. We talked earlier about rot and how rot happens if you get water in the crown or the place where the leaves attach. So it can happen so fast, you won't believe it. I mean, one day the plant will be fine, and then the next day you'll see it look waterlogged, and that's a really bad sign. If you catch it really quickly before it's spread, you can try peroxide or cinnamon. I've used cinnamon. Cinnamon has antimicrobial qualities to it. And I actually saved a plant by sprinkling it heavily with cinnamon. You remove all the waterlogged tissue and then you treat it and then you pray. Root rot. This is really common. And it happens, you know, when you're overwatering or not repotting in time. So, you know, you just have to examine your plant. And if if you're growing plants in clear pots, then it's much easier to see how the roots are doing without pulling the plant out. They have these hard plastic clear pots for orchids that you can get online, I know. And, you know, if you want, you can put them inside a decorative pot. But they're really useful for looking at the health of your plants without pulling them out of the pot, which you can also do, of course. Floppy leaves, over or underwatering. And yeah, you just got to examine your roots. So I'm pretty close to the end. I probably run over and I apologize. Here's a really great resource. I don't know if you've ever been up to Longwood Gardens Orchid Extravaganza, but they have a free online class that you can register for right now. I've put the link in here, and it's a multi-part class, and it can teach you even more about orchids if you're interested. So with that, I just wanted to show you a picture of my mother with one of her orchids. And this presentation is dedicated to her. And I'm done. So